Well, good morning to some of you, good afternoon to others, and good evening to a few other of our friends around the world. It's my pleasure to introduce the next session. Today we have with us guests Mike from Microsoft and Alyssa from Corda, and they're going to introduce us to digital ecosystems. So I will do the introductions. I know I'm supposed to say that there is a game going on. Let's see. So the secret word for this period is market. Market, and that makes sense for the direction of the talk. So I'll introduce and then step out of the way. When you guys are ready for questions from the audience, Mike, you can let me know, and I'll be listening and I'll come back on. Mike, Senior Director of Applied Innovation and Digital Transformation at Microsoft. He's one of our Executive Advisory Board members, so thank you for that, Michael. Mike is internationally known expert in innovation, strategy development, enterprise architecture. Mike holds the BNext, The Future is Now podcast series. He's got a book coming out with Forbes, and his fun fact is that he's terrified of heights, so that he thought skydiving would be a way to cure it. Now, Walmart sells underwear if that doesn't go well. I'll let you fill in the rest of those details. Dr. DiCaprio is the head of trade and supply chain at R3 in New York, covers strategy, trade governance, and global standards initiatives. Previously, she worked at the Asian Development Bank as a senior economist working on digital trade, trade finance, and innovation. DiCaprio has worked in both public and private sectors on export promotion, trade negotiations, and labor issues. Her PhD is from MIT. Her fun fact is that she regularly races in Ironman triathlons, 2.5 miles swimming on purpose, 112 miles bicycle, and a full marathon at 26.2 miles. Welcome to both of you, and I'm sure there's other things that you could purchase for the end of a day like that. So have at it, Mike. Thank you, and I'll be coming back on with audience questions when you guys are ready.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you to the university for having both of us on here today. And yes, I am terrified of heights, and no, skydiving did not cure me of that, as I hypothesized. Yeah, interesting fun fact. So today, we're not going to be talking about any of that stuff. We're going to be talking about digital ecosystems. And when Mary Lassity and I had this conversation around digital ecosystems, we knew we weren't going to be able to cover this off in 20 to 30 minutes. And so we're going to deliberately go fast. We're deliberately keeping this kind of a mile wide and an inch deep for you guys. Know that we'll be able to share the decks. We'll be available for questions and answers at the end of the session, but also after the session. And we're going to provide some links to some extended resources as well. So with that said, let's start sharing my screen here. Let's see if I actually do the right one. Yes, allow Zoom to share your screen. I would love for that to happen. And of course, my handy dandy Macintosh is giving me trouble and wanting me to restart Zoom. We got a great backup plan. Alyssa, do you have the deck?
I sure do. Let's see if I can make this work.
So while we're waiting for that, and Daniel, if you have access to the deck, which you should, if you could share your screen, that'd be fantastic. But we're just going to keep rolling with this because we can get into kind of the first topic as we're trying to pull this up. The first thing is, what are digital ecosystems? And so both Alyssa and I have an extended amount of experience in this space, as much as one could have with this emergent technology. I thought it would be good for us to start off with, what is a digital ecosystem? What does that mean exactly? And think of a digital ecosystem as kind of the next wave of traditional ecosystems. We have these traditional ecosystems already. It's just they're not very efficient. But now with digital technologies, we've got all these endless connections. We've got all this data that is now at our fingertips. And now the question is how do we orchestrate? I think that's the key word here, is how do we orchestrate this information in a meaningful way across multiple parties while also addressing the shared risk, the legal obligations. Lovely. Great. So if we proceed to the next slide. See, guys, we're just we can keep rolling with this. And so this is the technical definition. I'm gonna let you guys read this as we talk about this a little bit more, but no one wants me to kind of read verbatim this stuff. But the key essence is with digital technologies, it allows us to enable always on, always connected, multifaceted business models where we start to get into the digital platform economy with companies like Amazon, Apple, Uber, Airbnb, Microsoft. You keep naming the companies, the big companies that everyone's heard of. This is the predominant business model going forward. And I'll take it one step further, everybody. The top 10 companies based on market capitalization on the planet are all either platform business models or they show signs of moving towards this. So digital ecosystems is that key fabric that's stitching it all together. Now, keep in mind, it's not just one technology. There's many technologies that play here. There's technologies like blockchain that play a vital role here in the exchange of data, the security, the mastering of data, the interoperability of the data, et cetera. But also that's got to play well with other technologies, even traditional database technologies for off-chain access. And another aspect here, if we go to the next slide, we've got a kind of a cohesive framework on how to think about this. And so I would encourage everyone to think about this both from a technical and from a business perspective. And so with a digital ecosystem business framework, what we can do is we can understand the complexities from a business strategy perspective on what we need to address with our digital ecosystem. Because what you're going to find, and Alyssa's going to go through this, I'm sure, and we didn't pre-rehearse this part, so I'm going out on a limb here, but you'll find that there isn't one ecosystem that looks the same, and most companies have many ecosystems. So they have an ecosystem of ecosystem strategy. And so if you have questions around the digital ecosystem business framework that gets into kind of the governing structure, the strategy piece, what kind of capabilities you're going to enable, value realization, et cetera, along with the technical framework that will get into some of the key components you need to address to become a digital ecosystem. It's not just about blockchain. As much as blockchain is a key enabler, if you don't have a user experience, no one's going to adopt it. And someone asked me in an interview one time, they asked me, Mike, what was the best blockchain solution you've ever seen? And, I've said, essentially it's the solution that I had no idea blockchain was used, which is very, very true. So, so those two bits, we don't have enough time to go through them in depth, but I wanted to give you kind of the primer on those. And then lastly, on this slide, you'll see a method underneath. So if the two circles are the what, the bottom chevrons is how do I start to figure all this stuff out? And so I'm going to pause on this. Now, Alyssa, is there anything else that you want to build upon as far as, stuff? Because I've missed a ton of stuff. I already know that, but are there things that you want to highlight that would make sense here to share with the audience?
I would just spend like 2 seconds on the question of whether or not Corda is a digital ecosystem or there's a digital ecosystem around Corda, because I think there's potentially like a pretty solid example. Yep. Because, with R3, initially what we did was we made a very conscious decision to build the technology and try to build an ecosystem around that or enable one to grow. So initially when we started, we were 9 banks in September 2015. By December 2015, we were 42 banks, but that's still banks. I mean, is that really a digital ecosystem? Not really. So, you brought up the idea of being a platform, which Corda is, and then sort of opening up around it. So basically what we did is, we made the very clear decision to focus on the technology, make sure it works, and make sure it works for anybody that wants to build on it. So today we have more than 350 companies building in all ways. At different parts of the ecosystem. It's open source. Anybody can contribute to the code base. Basically we understand that we're good at technology. We're a startup. We can't do everything. And so we've done our best to enable other companies that want to contribute different types of apps that other people can use and buy and interact with in order to create that digital ecosystem around Corda. So that's kind of how I would contribute to the answer to this question. But yeah, I thought you set it out very clearly.
And, actually, Alyssa, I think to give credit where credit's due here, in how I look at Corda is, while it may not be technically a digital ecosystem that a end user organization would kind of use out of the box, I look at this very similar to companies like Microsoft or Salesforce or the other big tech companies. Is we're providing technologies for others to build very rich and comprehensive digital ecosystems. So while it doesn't check all the boxes, I don't think it has to. I think, this is a technology that is meant to enable digital ecosystems at scale. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what it's about, enabling others to build on this and making sure it works. I mean, I think that's the critical thing, right?
Yep.
Because if it doesn't work, nobody's going to build an ecosystem around it. Nobody's going to want to, contribute different applications and things like that.
And that's a great segue. And you've got a ton of really great examples. I'm sure I've got great examples as well. But as a segue into this, let's maybe talk about some of those customers that you've enabled with R3 Corda. I think just to give people a sense of what does this look like in the real world.
I always forget that I control both the slides and my own screen now. Well, yeah. So this is just some kind of considerations for how do you build an ecosystem. And what I thought would be useful to do here is really think about what exemplifies a company that's in an ecosystem. And so that's really why I brought up these couple of examples. And there's two or three that we can talk about. Here are just two of the projects. Ripe.io is in the agriculture track and trace. They track food characteristics. An interesting piece of this is it reminds us that like blockchain or Corda doesn't do everything. In fact, as a platform, it does really nothing on its own. If you have Corda, you can't really do much with it unless you have a workflow, in their case, they integrated IoT and soil sensors and things like that. So it allows you to do all these kind of like new, interesting things, but by itself, it's kind of like the Xbox without the games. So, with these examples, there's kind of, what you see is two things. The first is the integration of other technologies, which I think is pretty critical. The second is that they do provide other services to other application builders. So this is maybe more in the case of Contour, which is a letter of credit solution. And what we see is, different applications that are, say, building in supply chain management. They realize, okay, well, now we have POs and invoices on the platform. Well, we could also maybe offer trade finance, but we're not banks and we don't actually have the ability to do that nor want to do it. So, what you can do, because there is this digital ecosystem, is you can look for other applications that do that. And you can use those to offer the same services. So we see the different services being built that can be interoperable and you can interact with them in different ways. So you, as the supply chain manager that has this blockchain solution on Corda, don't have to build everything. You can just use these other components that are already there. So those are sort of the three examples that I think are most useful. Just to get the sense that there are additional services out there. Like maybe you can offer a KYC service, a know your customer service, or anti-money laundering or sanctions checking for vessels if you're doing cross-border trade. These are all examples of different applications that provide services that don't necessarily have to exist only on their own, but exist because they're part of the ecosystem.
That makes a lot of sense. And some of the key things that I really like that you pointed out is that blockchain really needs a killer app, right? It needs something that gives it life. It on its own really doesn't really do much for you. And so I think, that's one of the key takeaways, I think, from a digital ecosystem perspective is that it puts blockchain into real business context. It's able to drive real business outcomes because digital ecosystems is all about not only orchestrating the data across your B2B, B2C, B2E partners, but also it's about orchestrating the technologies that are used to enable all this. So, whether that's communications technology with, 5G or next gen wireless technologies to IoT and sensors and, actuators, et cetera, to artificial intelligence and how that can be used to create things like predictive analytics. Because now we've got this great data that's, pristine from a blockchain perspective. Now it's actually time to use it. And that's the great thing about digital ecosystems is it's really bringing that data to life. And so if we go to the next bit here, and again, everybody, we've got 20 minutes because we want to make sure we get to some of your questions as well. I thought that to do one takeaway, from Alyssa and I on what we would recommend to folks. And so I'm going to talk about more from a business angle. So if we go to the next slide, and if we reference our framework, our digital ecosystem framework, and if we say that there is a technical framework and there's a business framework, and then there's the thing that I actually build. So you see 3 distinct layers. The challenge is there's a lot of variability here. What are the options do I pick? What sort of legal model do I embark on? These are some of the questions that start to emerge as you start to venture outside of your boardroom, and now you've got 5, 6, 7, 100 different members from other boardrooms all converging to say, "Hey, let's all collaborate." So the one key takeaway that I want you guys to think about, and we go through this in the book, we go through this in the reference architecture material, is think really, really hard about the business model that you want to create for your ecosystem. And know that there isn't one ecosystem model to rule them all. It is perfectly acceptable to have multiple versions of an ecosystem. It's perfectly acceptable to have an ecosystem of ecosystem strategy that's very tailor fit and fit for purpose for very specific aspects. Let's say if you are in the airline industry, and we did a lot of work there, that standards for aviation parts is an open type of environment versus someone like a GE that we did work with, where they've got also private ecosystems that all work together. And so looking at founder-led models, partnership-led models, and cooperative-led models is going to be really important to set the stage and tone for all those decisions that will need to come. Even those technical decisions will hinge directly on the business model you choose. So that's my one key takeaway. Alyssa, what are some of the things that you want folks to take away?
Well, from a platform perspective, what I wanted to do here with this slide, which I thought was pretty interesting, is look at, my main takeaway is phase your solution. To your point, no digital ecosystem looks exactly the same, right? And these are just some of the considerations that you make. It exists on a spectrum. So for example, IP ownership. It can be anywhere from a consortium where the consortium owns the IP to where the business network designer owns the IP. We see both of those. To your point, the sort of founder-led, what we call business-led or technology-led, bottom-up, top-down models, both of those work, both of those exist. And what I did here is I put examples of different consortia that exist building around on Corda and where they fall. And you can see they fall everywhere.
Yeah.
And that also goes for, are you a commercial enterprise, nonprofit? Do you have open membership, closed membership? I mean, there's so many different decisions. So really phase what you're doing. And we see these particularly with a lot of our apps are cross-border. So they're in the logistics space. You brought up, aviation, parts, MRO, that kind of thing. These are cross-border issues. What you want to do initially is you want your application to work, right?
Right.
You want to create a very small part of the process. This is a new technology. And just take blockchain, use it for this small thing, and then expand it. So where we see projects that are cross-border, the initial project often is domestic, or even if it might even be local to the company. So you make sure that that works. You maybe work with your tier 1 suppliers, and then you expand to your tier 2, tier 3, if you're doing deep tier supply chain, for example. And so that's the most important thing. If you try to take the whole thing at once, it's often too much. You know, as one example, and I'll kind of stop here. There was a cross-border application that was tracking agriculture, and it was from New Zealand to China. They did it. It was great. And you know, I was talking to the application builder. I said, fantastic. You know, what are you doing next now that you've done this fantastic pilot? And he's like, well, we have to change the law, because right now everything has to be on paper. And so we got waivers for this application transaction, but that'll take about 4 years. So
Yes.
It's really important to have a phased approach.
So this is great. You know, it builds on the same concepts that we talked about with the first recommendation, and really provides some good quantification and qualification here. So, you know, like we talked about, we want to save time for Q&A. I want to hand it over to Dr. Mary Lassity here to, or Daniel, whoever is going to help us with the questions. Hand it over to that person, and we'll answer your questions.
Thank you, both of you. The ecosystems are a really interesting phenomenon because we don't have an existing regulatory framework for something that didn't exist 5 years ago. And trying to extend what we have sometimes works and sometimes doesn't work. And your stories are give us great insights to some of the challenges. So some of the questions that have come in, and we won't be able to get through all of them, but let me ask one. One was trust, the concept of trust in an ecosystem. Is that the same for all participants, or does trust mean something in either culturally different or different nationally?
So I'll take a quick crack at this because this is a very lengthy conversation, but I'll say it in a very pithy way. Trust is a lot like truth. It's in the eye of the beholder. And so for different ecosystems, they will handle trust differently. And what I'm talking about with trust is not only you can trust the data, but also what is the level of participation and membership within an ecosystem? Who can see what and when and how? Based on the business model, again, it will determine what sort of data rights you will have to that data. Now, since we're talking about blockchain, it's also predicated that there is going to be a level of data security and privacy. That's almost a given in this digital ecosystem environment. But really where the question around trust comes in is that next layer up when you've got business interests. So like in a founder-led model, you've got a conglomerate that controls the ecosystem, and then you've got competitors within that. Well, there might be a conflict of interest. And so it really depends on the business model. So you really have to think through those aspects. And that's why starting with the strategy is so important. 80%, I would even push it. I would say maybe 90% of these decisions are not technical. They're business questions. Alyssa, what do you think?
I would say that trust is important, but it means different things to different parts of the ecosystem. So for example, if you look at supply chain applications, often what you do is you may have a buyer that runs the application, and the suppliers are uninterested in being part of blockchain. Like, they don't want to run a node. They don't want to know what's happening. They trust the buyer. They work with the buyer. That's all they want to do is continue to work that way. So in that case, blockchain is not changing anything. The relationship hasn't made a difference at all in those relationships. But then where it has changed it is if you look at the industry wide, right? So normally when you think of innovation is in a corporation, right? It's a sense of competition. But when you're looking at innovation across a sector, what you see with blockchain in particular is this moving of the needle between what is competitive behavior and what is cooperative behavior. And that's where the issue of trust comes in, because you have to have competitors working together in order to make this work, right? In order to make this good for everybody, you need standards, you need to, sit in a room and argue with each other until you agree that this is how you're going to represent an invoice across the sector, for example. Right. So I think that's an important piece of this, is really thinking about moving the needle in terms of the entire industry.
Yeah, and I want to cap this off with one statement, Daniel, and that's, I think the pivot point is not trust, because like you've heard from both myself and Alyssa, it means different things for different people. And I think pivoting off of what you guys talk about, the internet of value, I think that is a much better thing to pivot off of rather than trust. because again, it's subjective. It means different things. It could be even regionalized. It could be based on the company, lots of different things. So really, in my mind, it's really about pivoting off of the value that I'm going to create for my company and my consumers.
Very nice. Let me shotgun you a few questions, and we just have a minute or two. Are there regulatory agencies in these ecosystems? Can one competitor block out another? Who controls process? Can it be revoked? Can it be transferred? Permissioning process questions. Lots of things along those lines. In 2 minutes.
Yes, and yes. The answer is all yes. And again, that's where it comes back to the business model that Alyssa and I are talking about, is that being very deliberate in understanding the implications of our decisions going forward is so critical. And that's why we came up with these frameworks, is so that we can help customers manage the complexity around these decisions that need to occur and not box them into a corner and limit adoption. That's the quick answer. Alyssa, was there anything else you wanted to add?
Well, I think those were a mix of sort of like technical and business questions.
Yeah.
I think Mike answered it really well. I would just build off of a little bit about the regulator issue, because I think that is important, right? I mean, we're building lots of things, and if you're building it without the regulators, you don't want to go knock on their door and be like, hey, we've got blockchain, what do you think? And they will absolutely stop what you are doing because they do not like it. Regulators are definitely part of these. The challenge is regulators have to stay neutral, right? So they're part of everything. So really what you want to think about is how to approach the regulator, and in what's, like, you don't want to share all of the data with them, for example. They want to be able to see the transaction, perhaps, as they're monitoring it, but they don't want all of your data. They want 4 data points. As you know, one example. So we've spent a lot of time figuring out what they need and figuring out how to get them, rather than just flooding them with data, which is possible, but which honestly they don't want. But they've been participating pretty heavily, not only in CBDC, the central bank digital currency projects, but all of them, just so they ramp up their understanding of what's going on. They are able to put in place regulations that make sense. Because they're not trying to regulate away innovation, but they really do need to understand what's happening. So I think all of the blockchain projects do have involvement with regulators as well.
And I'll go even further, Alyssa. Get those people involved early in your process. As soon as you've got your idea, get the lawyers in the room, get the compliance people in the room, understand what regulators need to be involved at what point, your data standards organizations, get all those involved early, or you're going to have problems later on.
Yeah. Postpone the technology talk. All right. Well, thank you both very much. I find this topic absolutely intriguing and incredibly important as well. So I'm grateful personally for both of you, and the Blockchain Center thanks you as well. If you're listening, remember, enter the secret word wherever secret words are entered. And we'll be back in about a minute with our next speakers. Thanks again.
Thanks, everybody.